Washington Journal continues.
Our first guest of the morning, Simon Rosenberg, Democratic strategist, a writer, a commentator, writes on Substack, joining us to talk about campaign 2024, particularly in President Biden's case. Mr. Rosenberg, thanks for giving us your time.
Great to be here, Pedro.
You put out a post yesterday on X. You talk about an event you're doing tonight, saying that you're doing a public presentation laying out my latest take on the 2024 election. You add, the bottom line, I would much rather be us than them. Why is that?
Well, listen, I think my basic take on the election is that Joe Biden has been a good president. The country's better off. We have a strong case to bring to the American people for his reelection. The Democratic Party is very strong. We're winning elections all across the country. We're raising tons of money. And I think we're fired up and ready to go for the election. And I think the Republicans are selling a flawed candidate, somebody who's far more diminished from where he was in 2016 and 2020. His agenda is far more dangerous and extreme. And I think the Republican Party itself is a huge shambles and a huge mess. And so I think we go into the election, I think, with a huge financial and organizational advantage and a better candidate. And so I think that over the next 5.5 months, I'm looking forward to the debate, and I think we're going to win the election.
Is the strong case mainly built on that he's not Donald Trump, or are there other factors?
No, I think, look, the basic reason Joe Biden was elected in 2020 was to get us to the other side of COVID, right? When you think about what he inherited in January of 2021, right down the street from here, right? The vaccines had not been distributed yet. Donald Trump had just mismanaged the COVID crisis. The American economy was struggling. The global economy was struggling. We had just had an attack on the Capitol, an insurrection, an attempt to overturn an American election. The first time we had not had a peaceful transfer of power in our history. Joe Biden inherited one of the worst circumstances that any president's ever inherited in our history. And look where we are today. Right, we had the strongest economic recovery of any advanced economy in the world. Inflation here is lower than any other advanced economy in the world. We had the best job market since the 1960s. The stock market's breaking records, the lowest uninsured rate in American history. We have a startup boom. We've had these 3 big bills that Biden passed that are going to be creating opportunity and jobs for people for a generation to come. We're accelerating the energy transition. He's been a good president. Crime is down. Now we've seen even the flow to the border this year has plummeted from last year. We have a strong case. I think the country's clearly better off. That's what this election, I think, will be about in part. It's going to be a central part. And then we'll be talking about, what he's going to do in the second term versus what Trump does. And I also think that contrast will be very favorable to us.
You talk about one set of circumstances that find favorable for Joe Biden when you look at items like polling. And in your lifetime, you've looked at items like polling, and you see the most recent one about these key states where former President Trump leads and concerns about Biden among certain sectors. How do you read that versus the public?
Well, we even got some more polling today from Bloomberg, just literally came out right before I came on here, which shows the election is close. It's a close election. It's close in the states. I mean, there's a limit to how accurate polling is, right? At this point, the polling's not all pointing in the same direction. Today, for example, in the Bloomberg poll, we're tied in Nevada. And in the New York Times poll, we were losing by 11, right? And we're ahead in Michigan. In another poll, we're down in Michigan. We're down in Arizona. In the Bloomberg poll, we're up in Arizona. In another poll, I think the fairest way to read the data today is that the election is close. Neither side is leading or ahead. And we're in the end of the first quarter of a basketball game, and it's tied, and we got 3/4 of the game ahead of us, and where most of the election is going to take place. But as I said earlier, having been through a lot of campaigns, when I look at the total landscape, right, I would much rather be us than them, because I think we have a better candidate, a better argument, and a better organization underneath us to go prosecute the campaign over the next 5.5 months.
November, close in terms of elections. When you're seeing even data like this, so close to an election, does that concern you because it's not further out?
No, we have work to do. I'm not sitting here being Pollyannish, right? I mean, Joe Biden's not where he wants to be, but I don't think Donald Trump is where he wants to be either. I mean, I think this is a close competitive election. It's the tied game at the end of the first quarter, and we've got a lot of the game ahead of us. And as I said, structurally, I think that there is not as much attention in Washington right now to the financial and structural organizational advantages that Democrats have right now. I think this has been underreported. I mean, we've never seen a candidate with 3 to 4 times more money than the other candidate this late in the cycle. The Republicans haven't even begun to build their general election operation. We're many, many months into it. And and I've worked in 2 presidential campaigns, these kind of general election operations is like building a battleship. It takes many, many months. The Republicans are really past the point where they're going to be able to build an effective general election operation. So I just look at all this. Look, I'm not telling you, I'm saying what's the likely thing. I think the likely thing is that we win. Is it guaranteed? Are we the higher seed in the basketball tournament? The higher seed still has to go win the game and beat the other team, right? So, but I am sanguine. I'm optimistic and confident that what's in front of us, that I would much rather be us than them as we head. And by the way, early voting starts on September 20th. So the election actually begins in 4 months, not 5.5 months. It's kind of incredible.
Simon Rosenberg joining us for this conversation. If you want to ask him questions about campaign 2024 issues, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and 202-748-8002 for Independents. If you want to text us your thoughts, you can do that at 202-748-8003. In our previous conversation, we were talking about matters of inflation and the economy. Is this how much of a factor is this as far as Joe Biden's reelection?
It's a big factor. I think that I think the economy is far better off. We're going to have to go fight that out, right? Because there's obviously concerns. But I think of all the polling data I've seen in recent months, the data that gives me the most optimism is the Wall Street Journal did a poll of the battleground states, and they asked a question: are things in the last 2 years, have they gotten better in your state? Not nationally, but in your state. And in every state, it was 15, 25, 30 points, majority saying things were better. Well, things are better if people believe in the 7 battleground states that things are clearly better. Well, that's our whole argument in the election. So, it's going to be easy for us in the relative terms in a campaign to be able to say, well, you think things are better in Arizona? That's because of Joe Biden and the Democrats, because it's true. And so I think that us to be able to make that connection between people's sense that things are better in their states, which is where the election is taking place. It's not a national election, it's in these states. There's a clear sense in people's lives that the country is, that where they are, things are better. They may think the country's not doing so well, but this election's happening in 7 states. It's not happening across the country. And so I feel, and also we saw, even in that New York Times Siena poll last week that was not very good for us, they asked a question about life satisfaction. 74% of Americans said they were satisfied with their lives. Only 24% said not. We also know from polling that people are very happy with their jobs and their incomes at the very highest level. So there isn't a sense there isn't a sense of rebellion and anger in the country. If there was, Democrats wouldn't have been winning elections all across the country over the last 2 years. There's enormous actual life and job satisfaction underneath all of this, and a sense that things have improved. And that's one of the reasons why I think we're going to win the election.
Before we go to calls, one of the things that were featured quite frequently in the last couple of months was President Biden's age, supposed his mental faculties. How much did you buy into those concerns, or are those still concerns?
Oh, it's a legitimate issue. Of course it is. I mean, and I think that we have to make the argument that Joe Biden's been a successful president because of his age and because of his wisdom and his experience. That, it took somebody who was the most experienced person to ever come into the Oval Office to help us guide us through this choppy time in our history, and who's been able to go to work every day for the American people and get things through Congress, despite a very divided Congress, that nobody expected him to be able to do. And so I think that I view age as there's a balance sheet here. There's assets and liabilities, right? The assets are, we have a deeply experienced guy in the office in a time of challenge. The liabilities are obvious. And I think but I think it's unfair to view his age solely through the prism of liabilities. I don't think that's actually the case.
Our first call for you comes from Jason. Jason is in Indiana, Democrats line for Simon Rosenberg. Jason, hello. You're on with the guests. Go ahead.
Hey, Jason.
Thank you. Thank you to C-SPAN. Hey, Simon. I saw you recently on the Bulwark podcast and really enjoyed you being on that. I listen to that podcast every day, just like I listen to C-SPAN, Washington Journal every morning. And I got to tell you, I'm so angry about how ineffectual Democratic messaging is versus Republican messaging. I'll give you an example. Yeah. In the last couple of weeks, this week with George Stephanopoulos, Jamal Simmons, and Kate Bedingfield are on there. There's a Republican senator on there, and he mentions Joe Biden's border crisis. This is actually the guy from Texas who voted to impeach Trump, but he's a reasonable Republican, but he's still got his talking points down.
Yeah,
he's got them tight. Abe Bedingfield and Jamal Simmons both failed to mention the bipartisan border bill that Biden would have signed and that Trump tanked through Mike Johnson. Another example is this weekend on this week with George Stephanopoulos. I forget her name. She was also part of they used to work in the vice president's office or whoever. And she's on there, and they're talking about Samuel Alito flying the seditionist flag. And they're asking her about it, and she's commenting about it, and she says, well, that's just not the best decision-making to put that flag out in front.
Okay.
So, what's your question is, what can we do to better? Yeah. Well, listen, it's one of the reasons I'm here, is that I think, look, this is going to be a long campaign. 5.5 months are ahead of us. There's going to be a lot of forums like this. And I think we have to recognize that in the country, the Republicans have a much more powerful day-to-day propaganda machine than we do. I think we're better in campaigns. I think where we even things out a little bit and where we've been evening things out in recent elections. We had a good election in 2018 and in 2020 and in 2022 and 2023, and we're doing well in 2024. I think because of the support of the American people, the money we're raising, the powerful campaigns we're building, we can kind of close the gap with the Republican propaganda machine that they have every day during the elections. But I think that in the day-to-day, in discussions like this, we're still a little bit outmatched. And I think that Fox News and the whole huge propaganda machine on the right has created an imbalance in our daily discourse. And so we start a little bit behind every day. But where we make up ground and even get ahead is when campaigns begin. And this is another reason why I think we're so confident that as we prosecute our campaign, spend our money, go out and talk to voters, we've seen again and again in 2018, 2020, 2022, 2023, when that process begins, we win, Republicans lose. And I think it's one of the reasons we're so fundamentally confident about the moment.
From Sam on our Republican line. He's from Florida. Hi.
Hey, Sam.
Yes, sir. I do agree with you on the organizational part that the Democratic Party is vastly superior in their organization and how they go about getting their voters out or getting the votes out from their voters. I would have a couple of questions that I strongly disagree with you about.
Yep.
First of all, my first question is, I seriously don't think, as an everyday American, you've been out of Washington, D.C. in the last 24 years. Things are not better. Things are not better. You can't take a inflation rate of 1.4 up to 9 and then drop it back to 3 or 4 and say that things are better. You can't go to Publix in the state of Florida here and look at their food prices and say that things are better. I would also ask you that I can understand why you're confident about the vote because of the organization, but I would also ask you, just explain to me where you think the propaganda is when you've got the entire mainstream media siding with the Democratic Party.
It's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, great question.
Sam in Florida.
And I think, Sam, the first one that Sam asked is going to be the central debate in the campaign. And what I was saying was that people in the battleground states believe things are better, right? I think they're better, objectively and statistically. And so part of it is, Sam, is that I'm just referring to a question done by the Wall Street Journal, owned by Rupert Murdoch, right? That people in the battleground states themselves believe things are substantially better where they live. They may not believe it's better in the country. And so that gives me hope as a Democrat that we can make that connection between. But the second thing is that we have to be, I understand about the inflation shock that happened in America, but a majority of voters do not believe it's Joe Biden's fault. And this is a really important point about inflation. And I think this is something the media has missed. And by the way, it's not Joe Biden's fault in reality. I mean, what happened was inflation was a global phenomenon. It happened all across the modern world. It was driven by COVID, supply chain disruptions, OPEC, cutting production and raising prices. I mean, if you're angry as an American citizen about gas prices or about inflation, you should be really mad at Vladimir Putin, because the central reason that our gas prices went up and our food prices went up in the big spike that happened in 2022 was because of Putin's war in Ukraine. and then the subsequent efforts by OPEC and MBS and Saudi Arabia to cut production and raise gas and oil prices. And so we know from just the economics of this that a big chunk of the inflation that happened was not due to American government policy, because it was universal all around the world. And Sam, what you should realize is that inflation's lower here than any other developed country in the world, any advanced economy in the world. So it's a global phenomenon. We've managed it better than anyone else. Is it where we want to be? Absolutely not. But we had a good inflation number the other day, right? We had an encouraging sign on inflation. Things are getting better, right? But we have work to do. But I am confident that if we have this debate, Sam, that I think we can make our case and bring some of you along that may be a little bit skeptical about that. The second question about propaganda is that, look, I mean, Fox News is essentially, is a very powerful machine for pushing Republican talking points and views every day that has there isn't an analog on our side. And I don't believe the mainstream media is aligned with the Democratic Party. As somebody who worked at ABC News and grew up in the media business and deal with journalists every day. I mean, yesterday I had one of the hardest interviews I've ever done in my professional career, with the New Yorker magazine, supposedly kind of a lefty magazine. It was the toughest interview I've ever done. I deal with journalists every day. The media is not aligned with the Democratic Party. I think the media, as you try to every day, Pedro, tries to stay this middle course and to try to stay objective. And so I think this idea that there's sort of right-wing organizations fighting mainstream media that's aligned with us, I just don't think that's the case. I don't think that's an accurate representation of the way it works every day.
Do you think Fox News still embraces former President Trump as they did?
I think they embrace Republican narratives and stories every day. And I think particularly they move stories that denigrate Joe Biden with incredible enthusiasm and force and effectiveness. Fox News is very effective. It's a formidable adversary for us. We don't really have an analogous thing. I mean, as I said earlier, my view is day to day, our discourse, our discussions, calls you get here are much more heavily shaped by Republican institutions than they are by the mainstream media or the Democrats. But where we make up ground is because we have incredibly enthusiastic supporters all across the country who are giving us more money than we've ever had and allowing us to build the biggest campaigns we've ever had, control the information environment in the states, and win. But for Democrats, we've got work to do to try to create some kind of strategic response to Fox and the strategic investments Republicans have made over a long period of time.
President Biden has agreed to a debate with former President Trump. 2 debates.
Yeah.
Thank you. What are the benefits for that? Him doing that? What are the liabilities possible?
I think it's great for democracy. I think there was a real question whether Trump would debate at all. Trump skipped the 3rd debate in 2020. He skipped all the Republican debates this cycle. And I think Joe Biden wants a debate. I think it's good for the country. And so what he did was that Trump said, I'll debate anywhere. And so Joe Biden said, let's do these 2 debates. Let's start with this. And Trump agreed. And now we're going to have a debate in June and a debate in September. And I think that there are 2 things about the debates that are important. One is that, early voting, as I mentioned earlier, is starting on September 20th. People begin voting now. Our election system has changed in America in recent years. And many of the debates were happening long after people had already started to vote. And I think the Biden campaign said, no, we want the debates before people vote, right, to help inform their decision. So those 2 debates are going to happen before the voting begins, which I think is good for everybody, right? And the second thing is I do think bringing the election earlier in June is also good for everybody. This is a big decision people have to make about the future of the country. Let's let them have more information rather than less. And if Donald Trump is going to skip debates, as he's done before, let's find out he's going to do it in June and not at the end of September. I'm still skeptical that he's going to show up, but we'll see.
From Albert in Delaware, independent line.
Yes, Mr. Simon, I wanted you to know that my wife says that there are not enough crazy people in this country to re-elect Trump. And I agree with her, and I think that should be a talking point. Second of all, the Washington Post printed that there was Trump told 30,573 lies in his 4 years in the White House. That came out to about 20.9 lies a day, and that has to be put out there. But I love everything you say, and I think you're the smartest operative in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll take that one. Not all calls are like that one, but thank you. And listen, I think the question about Trump as a leader, as a man, as a moral figure in our country is fair game. I mean, Mitt Romney has said repeatedly that the reason he can't vote for Donald Trump is because he doesn't believe that somebody who paid for sex with a porn star and has been found by a judge and a jury to have committed sexual assault should be president of the United States. I agree with that. I mean, Donald Trump, given his legal track record, would not be able to be the leader of any public institution in the United States or virtually any private institution. Why do we have lower standards for president than we would for a university or even a high school, right? I mean, Donald Trump has now been adjudicated and found by 2 courts to have committed sexual assault and raped E. Jean Carroll in a department store dressing room in New York, and to have committed one of the largest financial frauds in all of American history. Those are facts on the ground. Those have already been decided by judges and juries. And so, yeah, I think there are legitimate questions where somebody who would not be able to be hired to be a cashier in a Costco is also eligible to be president of the United States. I think this is legitimate and fair ground, and I appreciate the caller bringing this stuff up.
Here's Roy. Roy in North Carolina, Republican line.
Dude, you are so full of it. So number one, the propaganda machine, the only thing that you can mention that the conservatives have is Fox News. And Rupert Murdoch hates Donald Trump. I mean, yeah, we've got 80% of Fox News, 20% hates Trump. But that's the only organization that you can mention that has conservative ideas out of ABC, NBC, CBS, the BBC, all of them. And you even mentioned that you worked with ABC or NBC or one of them. And so real quick, let's talk about inflation. What was it that is on video, which C-SPAN won't play, of Joe Biden going up to that college student and saying, we're going to destroy fossil fuels. We're getting off of fossil fuels. You read my lips. And here we are. The inflation spiked way before this Putin thing came up that y'all just love because you use it for an excuse as to every bad thing that's going on in the world.
Okay, Roy.
When fuel prices went up, that's when inflation went up because fuel goes into every single thing in this world almost it is made. Even the streets are paid with petroleum-based product. You, sir, are a liar.
Thank you, Roy.
Okay, that's Roy in North Carolina.
Roy, I think the big lie, since you've brought up the liar word, which we knew would come up today, is the argument that Joe Biden created higher gas prices and inflation. The whole premise of that, if I can work through it, is that by Joe Biden saying that he wanted to transition the American economy to a more renewable and cleaner economy, which every country in the world is working towards, even Saudi Arabia, by the way, is that somehow that, through those magic words, generated higher gas prices. The truth is that in 2023, America produced more oil than any year in American history and more oil than any country's ever produced in the history of the world. We produced more natural gas and exported more natural gas than any year in American history. And we produced more renewable energy last year than any year in American history. We are more energy independent today than we've been in decades. And this whole argument that somehow Joe Biden has waged a war on oil, if he did, it's the worst war that anyone's ever waged because we just saw the highest domestic production of oil in American history and of any country in the history of the world. This argument that Joe Biden is responsible for higher gas prices is false, untrue, and it's despicable the Republicans continue to do it because it's creating cover for the people who are responsible for higher gas prices, which is Vladimir Putin and the Saudi Arabian government. If you're angry about higher gas prices, you should be mad at Vladimir Putin, not at Joe Biden.
We were talking about this in the last segment. There's a chart there that's showing the sharp rise of inflation right after 2020. And how does that factor into as far as that increase?
So what happened, let's go back, what happened with inflation, right? Inflation went up universally because of the supply chain problems, right, which made it harder to get goods to the United States and to the developed world. But then the inflation spike that several of your callers discussed this morning that happened in early 2022.
Yep, in June, 9.1%.
Yeah, right, happened after the Ukrainian war. And the reason why is because gas prices went up all around the world And importantly, and your caller said something important, which is that gas is a multiplier of inflation, because anything that is transportation dependent the prices go up. Food prices go up because most fertilizer is petroleum based. And so the reason food prices went up in the United States was because of Vladimir Putin and because of Putin's attack on the Ukrainian, also because of his attack on the Ukrainian grain supplies, which drove up food prices all around the world. Putin tried to drive up inflation as a strategy to make the United States and the West walk away from the Ukrainian war. This was part of his war strategy. And so that spike, if you're pissed, and you should be pissed about what happened and angry about what happened with inflation, don't be mad at Joe Biden, who's gotten inflation down from 9% down to 3%. Be mad at Vladimir Putin. He is centrally responsible for what happened with the spike in inflation in 2022.
Is the decrease specifically to Mr. Biden's policies, or are there other factors
too?
The
Fed.
As far as...
the Fed. I think it's a combination of things, right? There's been a clear strategy of the United States and all the economies of the modern world, right, to bring inflation down. Supply chains were reestablished, right? A lot of the commodity goods that had spiked came down in prices, right? And gas came down. Oil prices came. Gas is way down from where it was in 2022 now, right? And so, yeah, there was an effort, and even the attacks on Biden for selling some of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which was designed to bring down gas prices. Joe Biden did a really big and important thing to bring down gas prices.
He made that decision yesterday, too.
Right. Yeah. And so, there's been, of course, he wants inflation to come down. And so I think we have to recognize that we're not where we want to be, but man, are we not at 9% anymore? We're down into the low threes. And the economy, look, the whole goal of economic policy is to create robust growth and to keep inflation under control. We just went through one of the largest economic shocks in global history with the COVID. And we have come out, in my belief, and this is what the election is going to be about, right? I think we've done a really good job managing it. And there's clear data showing that we've managed it better than any other advanced economy in the world. Is there still more work to be done? Absolutely, Roy. I agree with you. We're not where we want to be on this. But if this, and even on gas prices, right? You've seen the last 4 weeks, gas prices are coming down in the United States right now. They're not going up, right? And so let's hope that continues for everybody who's watching today. We would like gas prices. And by the way, food prices, which is the other thing that gets mentioned, has now dropped last month. We just saw Target announce that they're cutting the prices of its Target, right? Cutting the prices of many goods. McDonald's is going to cut prices.
But isn't that more reactionary to people's concerns about the current state of inflation?
Yeah,
more than
but that's
else?
good news, right? Let's celebrate the good news when it comes, because we don't always have good news. We can say things are better, but we still have work to do, right? These are things we're allowed to say. Things are clearly better in America, but we're not where we want to be.
This is Simon Rosenberg joining us for this discussion. Democratic strategist, also writes on Substack. Where do you write? How can people find it?
It's called Hopium Chronicles. It's free. You can check it out on the internet. It's hopiumchronicles.com, and check it out on my website, or there's a way to subscribe daily. That's free. It's a community now, about 75,000 people. The water's warm. You get content 6 days a week, live events. I'm speaking tonight to everybody for free. It's been a great project. I've really enjoyed it.
In Iowa, this is Kim, Democrats line. Hi.
Mr. Rosenberg, I want a question.
Yeah.
Black people is the 14% of this country. What have the Democratic Party done for Black Americans other than, I remember in 2018, 2019, even 2021, they put a bill up and passed it, the George Floyd bill. That didn't pass in the Senate. We have voting rights. That didn't pass. So why is not Joe Biden putting executive orders on everything? Because I still see around the country the police haven't been reined in for accountability. I still see Black children getting hurt by the officers and polices. He has not done anything but gave up talk about the economy. And most Black Americans, especially young ones, is having a hard time of finding jobs, trying to pay rent. What is he going to do? Because all I hear is that he gave out semiconductors and what that's going to do for Black Americans. So I would like to know what have the Democratic Party for the last 50 years done for Black America.
Okay.
The last person that did something was Bill Clinton. So what are they going to do?
Gotcha, Kim. Thank you.
Well, I think a few things, right? I think that first of all, I want to just recommend to the caller that she read the president's speech that he gave at Morehouse College on Sunday, where he addressed many of the questions that she had and talked about his own. And I learned something about Joe Biden in that speech I didn't really know. And I had sort of read about it, but he reminded us that his political career began because of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and that Wilmington, Delaware, was a city after the urban riots in 68, had a longer occupation by the National Guard than any other city in America. I didn't know that, right? And so he began his career. He quit a fancy law firm. He went to work as a public defender, and was a young guy in his 20s in the civil rights movement in Delaware, and then ran for the Senate. And so his whole career has been based on, and began, the whole reason he got into politics was over civil rights. And I think just a few things, right? The black unemployment rate has been lower under Biden's presidency than any presidency in American history. The uninsured rate for African Americans is lower today than it's ever been, which is helping people stay healthy and have good lives, right? We've seen he's made unprecedented investments in historically black colleges and universities, to help bolster those schools for opportunity. He's also appointed the first black woman. I mean, he chose a black woman to be his vice president. Kamala Harris is the first woman of color to ever sit in either the presidency or the vice presidency. His appointment to the Supreme Court was a black woman, right? And I think that in terms of fighting for civil rights and our freedoms, every day, Joe Biden has made the fight for democracy and freedom the central argument of his entire presidency and his reelection. And he understands the gravity of the challenges that we face. And so I think he has a strong case to make to African Americans, that he's been on their side and advanced the African American community. But I encourage the caller to read his Morehouse College speech. I think he directly addresses this more articulately than I will. And he just gave a speech on this on Sunday that I think was wonderful. And to me, it was one of the most important speeches of his presidency, actually. It was really a powerful and very personal reflection on America since the 1960s.
And viewers, you can still see it on our cspan.org if you want to check out that speech. Mr. Rosenberg, to what degree do you think that President Biden might lose constituents, whether they believe black or otherwise, because of what's going on in Gaza and the United States policy there? Yeah,
look, I think Gaza I think the debate around Gaza and Israel is giving Joe Biden an opportunity. I think it plays to Joe Biden's strength, because he is a strong foreign policy leader. It's been one of the areas he's focused on through his entire career. And I think the country needs to have a big discussion about what's happening in Ukraine and in the Middle East and with China, right? These are things that our lives are changing. I mean, we're leaving a period in America that was relatively peaceful to a world that that's going to be a little bit choppier and more adversarial. And we should have an honest conversation with the American people about this. I think we should run into this debate. We shouldn't run away from it. I don't think we have anything to fear. I also think polling, and these things can change, right? I mean, polling, everything changes. All of a sudden we have debates. We didn't have debates a week ago, right? Elections change. But for many Americans, Israel-Gaza is a distant concern. It's an important issue, but there are other things that matter more, like making a living and inflation and healthcare and loss of reproductive freedom and loss of democracy if Donald Trump becomes president, climate change, gun safety. There's a whole immigration. For many Republicans, this is a central issue, right? So I think that what is likely is that it will be a secondary issue in the election. Not unimportant, but there'll be other things that matter more, I think.
This is from John. John's in California, Republican line. Hi there.
Yes, good morning.
Hey, John.
Hey, I want to address the issue that he said, the sex scandals with Donald Trump, when you had a president of the United States, Bill Clinton, in office having sex with in the Oval Office. You got Jesse Jackson. You got Weiner. There's all kinds of President Kennedy with Marilyn Monroe.
Yep.
All these politicians. And he says he's not qualified, but yet you have all these other politicians that are doing the same thing. And I want to know what you think about that. I'll take your answer online.
Sure. I think, and I'll do this quickly because I think I'd like to move on to other things, but I think that there is a difference between consensual sex that happened and what happened with Donald Trump and E. Jean Carroll, which has been determined by a jury and by a judge that he raped her. And I know this is uncomfortable to talk about. This is a hard thing to, the term has been used, sexual assault. The judge said that rape.
I think sexual abuse is the term.
Yeah, sexual abuse, and that he committed.
The judge clarified
right that it was actually rape was within that it was okay to describe it as rape under the law in New York, and I think that we know that, and we also know what's happening in New York right now. I mean, that Donald Trump cheated on his wife, who had a young newborn child at home, and paid off had an adulterous affair with Stormy Daniels, and then now has tried to cover it up in the election in 2016. These are tawdry things, and I think that my basic point, though, is that any leader who had been indicted 88 times for felonies, who had been found guilty of sexual abuse or rape, who had been already found to have committed massive financial fraud and has been fined hundreds of millions of dollars, and he and his two sons have been banned from doing large amounts of business in New York State, that anyone with that kind of track record would not be eligible to go work in any leadership position in any institution in the United States, or even get a job like working at Costco, right? If you're under 88 indictments and you've been found guilty of sexual abuse. And why it is that we have a different standard or a lower standard for the most important political office in the world than we do for being a cashier at Costco, I'm not really sure I understand.
This is from Dennis. Dennis is in Ohio, joining us on our line for Democrats. Dennis, good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. I would like to make a comment. I have noticed that Trump supporters, and this includes my brother-in-law, are in denial. They look the other way. They don't want to hear this stuff. I think what the Democrats need to do if they want to win the election is they need to run an ad, just a short ad, and keep repeating over and over the things that Donald Trump said about women, what he said about people in the military, just little short snippets showing him saying these things so that the Republicans who support Trump cannot be in denial about these things. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I think there are a lot of things voters are going to come to learn. I mean, I didn't get into it earlier, but one of the reasons I'm optimistic that we're going to win is there are a lot of things voters are going to come to learn about Donald Trump that they didn't know about him in 2020 when he lost the election, right? And that I think are going to be difficult for him to overcome. I mean, we've discussed some of them, but I think the other thing that is in the news today is the issue of the stolen documents. I mean, Donald Trump stole from the United States hundreds of classified documents. He lied to the FBI about him possessing them, which is a felony level crime. He shared those secrets with other people. We know that. And it is, without question, the greatest betrayal of the country by a former president in all of our history. And that, to me, is another one of these things that should be an out-and-out, just automatic disqualifier. How can we trust this guy? And why did he take these documents? Why did he work so hard to hide them? What the news is this morning is that even after the FBI raid, where they thought they had gotten all the documents, Trump hid and kept documents from the U.S. government after the FBI came in to Mar-a-Lago, meaning that the government had made it clear that he needed to return everything, and he continued to hold back documents. And the question is why, right? What in the world, why was it so important for him to hold those things back? And there's only one real explanation for that, is that he was trying to sell them to other people, or he was using them as political leverage over other people. And I think there is no good answer to that. And I think this is also something to your caller's point, is that there are going to be a lot of things that people are going to come to learn about Trump that they didn't know about him in 2020 that are going to make it very difficult for him to win.
The columnist Ezra Klein for the New York Times recently wrote this: the mistake Democrats keep making about Trump again and again is to assume that the rest of the country will see him as they see Trump. But Trump won in 2016. He came scarily close in 2020. Absent the pandemic, he might have well been reelected. What Democrats want to do in 2024 is run against the threat Trump poses to American democracy. And whether democracy is still America's sacred cause is the most urgent question of our time. That's what Joe Biden said on January 5th in a speech that kicked off his campaign. But it's not working, or at least it's not working well enough.
I agree. I agree that we have work to do. I've said that many times this morning.
But did you just say that it's not working?
I agree with Ezra that we have work to do.
Okay.
And that's what I agree with, right? We have work to do. And I think that, again, I go back to this basic idea that, you know, the way campaigns are built in order to inform the public about things you want them to know about your candidate and things you want them to know about the other candidate, right? That's why campaigns exist. Our campaign is really just beginning. I mean, it's in its early stages. And, you know, and I think that the American people over the next 5.5 months are going to come to learn a whole bunch of things about Donald Trump that they didn't know before. They're going to make it very difficult for him to win, because I think he really is a unique figure in our history. He does represent an unprecedented threat to American democracy, to our rights and freedoms. I mean, already because of him, the rights and freedoms of more than half the population have been stripped away in recent years. And I think we need to have an adult and honest conversation with the American people about what a second Trump term would really mean for the United States, the Western world, and the global cause for democracy. This is a debate that I'm sure is going to be happening over the next 5.5 months.
Republican line, Terry in Minnesota.
Good morning.
Hey, Terry.
Let me help you out, Simon. Wars, inflation, open border, highest homelessness in history, riots in the street over Palestine. I think that you're deluding yourself, thinking that Biden saying it's always somebody else's fault. Oh, it's Putin's fault. Oh, it's this fault. If he's not capable of controlling anything, what the hell good is he as a president? I'd also say this. You know what is tawdry? Tawdry is when Joe Biden made his teenage daughter shower naked.
No,
with
come
him.
on. It's outrageous. Thank you for that. Look, I think the caller makes some valid points, right? Things that we're going to have to address. I do think, though, if you're concerned about the border, and you discussed this earlier, or you raised it earlier, you know, you should be angry at Donald Trump, because the Republicans and in the Senate and the Democrats in the Senate came up with a bill that would address many of the concerns that we've had about the border. And Donald Trump told Congress not to pass it because he wants the border to be chaotic. And so the Democratic Party is the party trying to fix the border. It's the Republican Party that's now fighting for open borders, not us. And we know even just because of Joe Biden's work, the flow to the border has plummeted in early part of 2024. It's much lower than it was in 2023. So if
there were highs there too, as far as levels of
December, but it's come down. Yeah. I mean, it went up at the end of 2023. I mean, to be fair, it did go up at the end, but it's come way down. Mm-hmm. People are actually kind of surprised to some degree. I mean, you're seeing commentators who are experts in this saying we need to discuss what's really happening, because there's clearly been, and part of this is that Mexico and the other countries that, you know, see the flow of people coming in have really clamped down. Because of why? Because we've asked them to, and we're working diplomatically to try to control this flow. So for those on this program today who care about immigration and the border, we've seen Joe Biden has now exhibited the ability to get the flow down. We backed a bill that would bring resources, unprecedented resources, to get control of the border. And the people that are blocking that and are opposing it is Donald Trump and the Republican Party. Man, I would be angry at Donald Trump for that if I were a Republican right now.
One more question. If this is about messaging, like you started with, what's the one bit of advice you advise the Biden administration now as far as the re-election campaign? What can they do right now to change the perception
number one is we just have to ratchet up the campaign, right? We just have to be fighting at full bore in all the ways that you fight in a campaign, you know, where we have to begin the door-to-door program. We have to let the folks in the states, you know, start engaging day to day with Republicans, right? We got to go. I think we have my basic premise today is that we have a very strong argument to make. I want to get going. One of the reasons I'm here, right, is that we got to go take our case to the American people and make our arguments. And I do think that we have to, if I could, on one issue area, I still think we have work to do. On the central issue I think people care about is the economy. We have to make sure that our argument is as tight and as persuasive as possible, because I do think a lot of the election will come down to that.
You can find his work at simonwdc.substack.com. Simon Rosenberg joining us for this discussion. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Pedro.
Coming up, we're going to be joined by Behnam Ben Taleblu of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies to discuss this weekend's helicopter crash that killed the Iranian president, what happens to Iran after that, and what it means for the United States. That conversation coming up.
C-SPAN's Campaign 2020.